Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm with Eoghan Ballard. Welcome to the channel, Owen.
Hi, glad to be here. Uh,
Excellent.
so, given that some people may not know me, um, my name's Eoghan Ballard, and that is spelled Eoghan, not Owen. It's Irish, as am I. Um, I'm a retired academic. I got my doctorate in folklore at the University of Penn. Um, I taught for many years. Um, Anthropology, folklore, sociology, even a few stints in psych, um, because not because I'm a psychologist, but probably because I'm psycho. Um, so a long-term interest of mine has been Afro-diasporic religions, primarily of Congolese or Central African origins, Bantu traditions in the Americas. I am an initiated Palero, Kimbisa, several other Ramas as well. Um, I am a Vodou sign, or as they say in Cuba, because I'm initiated into a Cuban family tradition, Vodouista. Um, and I'm also an Espiritista
Yeah,
because
and then that's what we're going to be talking about today is Spiritismo specifically. And yeah, I guess with this first part, we'll just kind of give a background, like we talked about, where how it relates to other traditions, how it came about, and then in part two, we'll talk about the methods for communication and working with the dead. But yeah, so if you want to just lead us off, what is the how did Spiritismo form, and what does it primarily deal with?
Okay. Espiritismo, in Cuba, there are a number of varieties of, if you would, folk or popular um, Espiritismo in Cuba today, and they're each distinct. Um, there's Espiritismo de Cordon, which is from the east of Cuba, um, which deals largely with resolving negative spiritual attachments. They have beautiful rituals, beautiful misas, beautiful music. And in their misas, they do dances, which are used to basically raise power to knock out whatever spiritual problem the individual being treated has. Um, that's a quite distinct form of Espiritismo. Then you have Espiritismo de Caridad, which partakes of a lot of those characteristics, but does not have the complex hierarchy and um, temple or centro, because they're not temples, they're centers, um, um, organization that you find in Cordon. Rather, it's a much more homegrown version. It has some aspects that are similar to Cruzado and others that are like Cordon. But rather than having a large center with half a dozen different mediums all performing specific roles, there's maybe one or two people, and it's done in someone's kitchen. Um, then we have Espiritismo um, cruzado, meaning mixed or crossed Espiritismo. I will note all of these terms are largely terms that have been coined by academics so that they can discuss these different forms. Because wherever you go in Cuba, they're mostly going to just say, soy espiritista, I'm an espiritista. And you will simply know that because you're part of the culture and you know what they do, and it'll be different in different parts of the country as well.
So is it family oriented where it's kind of like passed down, or it's very much
Um,
community oriented? It's not like somebody goes to another community and becomes one, or
yes, I like doing that. Ask me an if or that question, a binary question, and I'm going to go, yes. And you'll find I do that a lot. It can be something that is taught within the family, but as like as not, it will not be. And that's very much an individual case. There's something distinct about cruzado I need to mention, and I don't want to take up too much time describing the different types. We want to go for a sort of an impressionistic picture here. Cruzado is called crossed or mixed, and the term cruzado, like in English, can either have meaning that it's mixed or blended or crossed, or it can have messed up, as in crossed, as in a cross condition. So if you say to an espiritista, oh, you practice Espiritismo cruzado, they're either going to go, okay, yeah, I guess you can call it that, or they're going to get offended. Because that crossing means that whoever is doing it usually in conjunction or even in the service of one or another Afro-Cuban religions, like Palo, like Santo or Ocha, or like Abaqua, even Vodou, which is not Afro-Cuban per se, but part of the Cuban landscape, because there's a large Haitian community there. And all of these are distinct from the parent inspiration, which was Cardicism. And Kardec is
Say that
called
again? Cardicism?
Kardecisen.
I don't
Cardicism.
think I've heard of that at all, in fact.
Allan Kardec was a French educator, and he developed a form of spiritualism that he had become aware of from North America through Britain, and he made his own changes to it, and it became immensely popular in Latin America, Francophone America, and Brazil. Where it still, all of those places, it still is today. Cardicism has virtually no real presence in North America, except perhaps from a few Latino communities. But even then, it's mostly other forms of Espiritismo, because in Cuba, in Puerto Rico to a much lesser extent, and in Brazil, individual native forms of Espiritismo grew out of it. Cardicism is much more of the book, and we won't go into it much. But Cruzado is a form of practice in its own right. They will say, all Espiritistas will say it's not a religion. It is a scientific or it is a spiritual practice for working in a systematic manner with the dead. But in Cruzado, in addition to doing spiritualism on their own right, in their own forms, they will also very often work in conjunction with one of the Afro-Cuban religions. And quite often, the Espiritista will be a palero or will be a santero or whatever. There is no initiation. There will be people online trying to tell you there is and selling it to you, probably for a hefty price. But no, there isn't. And what they usually point to is a confusion on their part. There is a thing called coronación, which of course anyone outside of the Cuban context thinks, oh, a crowning. It must be like in Santo, an initiation. No, it's actually what you do for some poor soul who's not quite getting it. To help.
Why is that?
Help give them a boost so that they can actually see and get a sense of the presence of the spirits that surround them. So it's a single mass. It's misa. It's not a big deal. It certainly isn't something that's required to practice Espiritismo. But the thing that is distinct about Espiritismo, and I'll mention a few things that we talked about before. Espiritismo is a system that doesn't have an initiation. It's very individualized. It's for direct communication with spirit. And to work with the spirits in the Spiritismo, you have to work on yourself. And one of the things that is unique about it in relation to, or in comparison to Afro-Cuban religions. In Afro-Cuban religions, whatever they are, you get given spiritual objects. You get an initiation, you receive something. And through those external practices and things, you can begin to develop a higher spiritual state. None of them per se teach you in like a sit down and learn manner your own inner awareness. In Palo, for example, the goal is to, for the most part, you get prendas, you get possessed by muerto. And usually what they do is they will do things to throw you into a trance, and then you're in trance, and then the spirit will come into your trance. There's no further interior psychic development other than what you get through working with your spirits. But there isn't a self-conscious attempt to develop things the way there is in a lot of Western traditions, for example. And in Cuba, anyway, that mostly falls to the Espiritista. Because in the Spiritismo, you have to begin to learn how to communicate with and to sense your spirits, and in a real way to sense the barrier between you and them, or the porousness of that barrier in certain ways.
So a lot of the work happens like within yourself, and it's very much an individualized
Yeah,
experience in relation to the spirit you're working with.
yeah. And Espiritismo, there's a whole of approach, I would say, within all Afro-Cuban religions that they all adhere to, the notion of material versus espiritual. And these are not opposites, but they're binary ends of a spectrum. So if you think back to geometry class, you drew a line with a point on one end and a point on the other, and you could stick points along that line. So on the one hand, we're going to arbitrarily say on the left here, you would have Espiritismo. Actually, you would probably have the church first, and then Espiritismo. And then on the far right, you would have things like Palo, Vodou, if it's being considered, and Abaquá.
Okay, so it's heavier towards the church and what's acceptable by the church than other traditions.
Yeah. Well, everything in Cuba has a relation to the church. Everything relates to each other. It's a small island. Everybody's interconnected. And the real reason why you ever had people getting initiated both in Palo and in Ocha, for example, was not because there was any kind of spiritual need, but because somebody had married somebody from the other culture. And so you had a Congolese mother, for example, and a Yoruba father, and they both wanted their kids to have their traditions. And they fought about it even after it was done. So there was no ladder here. That's bullshit.
Gotcha.
Everything is complete in itself, but they overlap like a Venn diagram. So everybody has to do with the church. In fact, traditional houses, either in Ocha, Santo, Yoruba stuff, Orisha, or in Palo, in Cuba, this was certainly the case when I got initiated, the first thing they ask you before they go any further, you've been baptized, right? And if you haven't, off you go.
Okay, so that is a prerequisite then,
Okay.
very much relationship to church. That makes sense.
Yeah. Now in America, anything goes. You can get dispensation from J-Lo. But everybody also tends to do Espiritismo because that's very often, it's kind of like the gateway drug to ATRs.
Gotcha.
Most people, if somebody has a situation they need help, they're going to go to what resources are most readily available, either through family or in the neighborhood, or some friend recommends somebody. But it will quite often be an espiritista because it's, if you know little, you're not going to think as ill of a espiritista as something else, and you may think it's safer. But whether you do or not, an espiritista will often consult and provide solutions, and they may in the process recommend you go see a palero or you go see a santero because one of your spirits has a connection with that kind of thing. And that's how those connections get made. But this light to dark is both conceptual and practice oriented. So the church deals with candles and incense and prayer. And the Spiritista will deal with candles, incense, prayer, song, and plants.
Did you say plans or plants?
Plants.
Gotcha.
The green things that grow in your backyard.
Yeah.
Then you move a little down and you get to Ocha, which deals with a whole lot of material things, but they avoid bones. And they don't work with dirts.
So people in a spiritista would work with dirt and plants, would not.
No, I'm saying one step further toward the material from Espiritismo will be Ocha or Santo. And they still don't work with bones and dirts. Then you get the Palero, and of course, the Palero works with all of that. He'll work with plants, incense, candles, prayers, songs, dance, bones, human bones, dirts, animal carcasses, everything. That's very material. And he will point, and then there's Abaquá, which is a little less magic intensive because it's a whole different thing. And then the Palero will go and point to the Voodooista and say, oh, but, we're not that bad. They're really bad. They really do the heavy duty stuff.
So
So
is there a stigma even in these interrelated traditions? Is there a stigma between the levels between these dots on the line? Is there?
when somebody's ignorant, yes. Mostly the intelligent practitioners in any of these traditions have a great amount of respect for the other traditions. But you find in any tradition people who are just not well trained. They don't know as much, or they've been taught and acquired biases from their teachers. So, you will find santeros who will speak ill of paleros. And sometimes people you'd be surprised have those biases. But generally speaking, I find that those who know things with greater perception have no such biases. There's, it's just not there. But the Espiritista is the one who usually ends up training, offering the inner training, as opposed to the ritual training. And there is a distinction. Espiritismo is lighter on ritual, less complex, perhaps, in the magical practices, and certainly more limited in some ways, because an Espiritista will never do any kind of negative work. The most negative they will get will be to break a situation and return it. If they're doing something else, then whatever they're calling themselves, they're not really an Espiritista. They're
somewhere else along the line.
They're somewhere else along the line. They may be, they may be, as often will be called in Oriente, Eastern Cuba, curandera, who is largely like a medicine woman who does healing, that kind of thing, but also some magic. And there are a few other terms, muertero, which gets bandied about and misused constantly as a term, largely because there's no concrete definition of what it is.
Yeah.
It's somebody who works with the dead, and what that usually ends up meaning is someone who works with the dead but does it their own way.
That's basically what I do.
And so it's not a tradition that you can really pass on, because it's not a tradition. It's just somebody who's freelancing. Nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying, but we're discussing structure.
For sure, yeah. And so for this section, in the last 3 minutes, is there anything that you want to say about Espiritismo before we go to the next section, kind of like wrapping it up?
Yeah, it is first of all, it does not deal directly with orishas or infumbe or prendas, the infamous or famous or legendary prenda espiritual doesn't really exist, and we can get into that at some point. It is about working with the spiritual dead, and providing relief to people who are having problems. And in Cruzado, it often is the first introduction that brings people toward a life in one or more other Afro-Cuban religions. No initiation, so it's totally open to everybody, and practice can be pretty simple.
It does seem fairly limited compared to other traditions that I think we've discussed, and but it definitely feels. I didn't know anything about it, so I didn't realize it had restriction, but I didn't realize that there was no negative work in it whatsoever, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I guess you could say it's more restricted in some ways, and I would also suggest at the same time that it isn't.
So it's just based on what you're trying to do, and there's certain things that you try to do within the system.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah, I think that's a good cap on this section. But yeah, we will come back with part 2 here shortly. Thank you very much for joining me today.